All right, Parashat Mishpatim, my dad's bar mitzvah parsha, and a shift from narrative to law. Um, and I would say that uh, Rav Avital Hachstein doesn't materially change her approach despite the change in content. We're still going to see kind of a deep dive into one pasuk, um, a look at some midrashic material that surrounds it with a kind of analysis of how midrash is doing its work, um, in order to enable us to draw out a broader theme in Jewish text and ideas, with a sort of a message at the end. Um, so let's jump in. I'll share my screen. Okay, the title is Does the Majority Rule? From Parashat Mishpatim 57:77. Our parasha, as per its name, Mishpatim, meaning laws, is full of statutes, many of which have served as the basis of the Jewish civil law and procedure. In fact, the parasha contains all kinds of mitzvot, ben adam lamakom, ben adam lachavero, ritual, um, between man and God, interpersonal, but Mishpatim certainly seems to incline towards the judicial processes, and that's where she's going to focus. Indeed, many laws can trace their origin to our parasha. What happens in a case of a murder or in case of robbery, labor laws, what happens when one person's property damages someone else, what if the damaged party is a human being, and so on. I took once a semester long, and we just scratched the surface course at Revel Graduate School with Professor Barry Eichler, who was at University of Pennsylvania for many years, on Parashat Mishpatim and comparative ancient Near Eastern legal codes and laws. So there's a lot to unpack and lots of angles of analysis. Not only do we find the laws themselves, but also how to adjudicate them, the role of the court, the role of oaths, the prohibition of accepting bribes, and the demand for truthfulness on all sides. You can sort of see this track in Seder Nezikin, in the order from amongst the six orders of the Mishnah, the order which deals with damages has kind of three Masechtot, Baba Kama, Baba Metzia, and Baba Batra, which are really probably all one, that deal with damages essentially. And then we move on to Sanhedrin, and there we talk about judicial proceedings and the way courts function. And not long after that, after Makot, we get to Shavuot, the laws of oaths. So there's sort of these things are largely collected in Parashat Mishpatim, even though they appear other places in the Torah, and they're kind of organized in rabbinic literature in Seder Nezikin. As can be expected, when the Talmud develops these laws, the direct line between the verses in our Parsha and the principles and individual laws derived from them can be hard to follow, right? Naturally, oral law is much more expansive, and while it in some way links itself back to written law, the line isn't always direct or easy to follow. Sometimes the derivations are somewhat roundabout, or more specifically, derived through the techniques of midrash. Often the broader context of the verses teaches something fundamental or essential about the law at hand. Thus, an initial read will suggest a simple lesson, and a second read will produce a broader and more complex picture of the law. So the pshat of the pasuk may teach us something, but then when we see how the midrash or rabbinic literature develops it, we'll get a much more expansive, complex picture. Our parasha presents a fascinating example of this phenomenon, in its serving as the anchor for the well-known principle of majority rule, something we certainly recognize in many more legal systems than just the Torah's legal system. Functions in lots of ways in our American democracy as well. So this concept of majority rule. This principle is expressed throughout the corpus of rabbinic legal texts, but is especially present in Masechet Sanhedrin, which deals with jurisprudential procedure. For example, the way that legal decisions are rendered in monetary cases. So this is Mishnah Sanhedrin, chapter 3, still dealing with Dinei Mamonot, with monetary law. And in chapter 3, Mishnah 6, it says, Shnaim omrim zakai ve'achad omer chayav zakai. If two of the judges of three This is a kind of standard beit din for adjudicating financial disputes. And then fascinating to see the way the judges are selected. Conversation for another time, but usually each side gets to choose one judge, and then either the two judges have to agree or the two sides have to agree on the third. And when the case is presented, if two of the three judges say, the one party is innocent, and a third judge says that that party is liable or obligated, then the person emerges innocent, and vice versa. Shnaim omrim chayav, echad omer zakai chayav, and if two say guilty or liable, and the other says not, then the person is guilty or liable. Simple majority rules. This is also the procedure for capital cases. Imatzu lo zechut patruhu v'im lav omdin leminyan. So here we're talking about a case where, one of the sins, and this is the bulk probably of Masechet Sanhedrin, a sin that carries with it a capital punishment. The witnesses are examined, the arguments are heard in the case, and if the court can find a kind of a way out um, of subjecting someone to the death penalty. And this is a little more complex than financial disputes. It's not an argument between two parties. It's whether we're going to indict a person and then sentence them to death or not. So there was always a bias, towards avoiding the death penalty. It's very clear in Masechet Sanhedrin. If they find a way to acquit the person, then they let him go. But if not, then omdim leminyan. Then they stand for account. What does it mean? This count is essentially a process of counting votes to determine what the majority of the judges think about the case so that we can rule accordingly. Okay, so capital cases also, after attempting to find a kind of a widely agreed upon way out of the death penalty, then it comes to a vote. And again, in the description of how the court adjudicates questions of ritual law. Okay, so we've done financial disputes, we've done capital punishment, and now we have a question where a question of Jewish law comes in front of the court, and they have to figure out how to rule essentially. Nishala she'ila bifnehem im shamu amru lahem. So the Gemara says the question gets asked in front of them, in front of the Sanhedrin. And if they have heard, this is actually, I believe, a quote from the Mishnah, although it's being quoted here as a passage in the Gemara. If they've heard the answer, then they tell them the answer. Meaning that if there is a tradition determining the halacha, they quote the tradition and rule accordingly. However, in the absence of tradition, they go according to the majority in this case as well. Right? So v'im lav, if they haven't heard an answer to this, omdin leminyan, then they actually have some kind of count, some kind of vote. Rabu hamitamim timeu, Rabu hamitaharin tahor, probably. And so if there's not a tradition which is known to answer this question of Jewish ritual that's come up, then there is a count. And if those who consider it, impure or whatever the, not acceptable in the particular halachic case is, then that ruling is followed, following the majority, of those who are offering their opinions here from the court. And if the majority say to make it, render it or rule it pure, then it's ruled pure. The scriptural anchor for this principle, so sorry, let's pause there for a moment to say, so we've seen, and here again, a slightly different approach than before. We're not delving into a story or a human quality and how it appears in different contexts in a chapter or in a passage. But we're taking this, we haven't even seen it yet, this notion of majority rule, and seen that it kind of follows through in rabbinic law across all kinds of types of rulings that would need to be made, which isn't necessarily obvious when you read the Torah. And now we want to know, where does all this come from? The scriptural anchor for this principle is, you shall neither side with the majority to do wrong. You shall not give perverse testimony in a dispute. Incline after the many. Rabim. We're going to look at this pasuk for a moment, and then she'll come back to do a closer read a little bit later. But this is from our Parashah, after a whole host of damages and then other interpersonal kinds of laws, and a little bit about human and animal laws. We come to chapter 23. Lo tisa shem hashav al tashet yadcha im rasha liot eit chamas. Don't carry false rumors. Don't join with the wicked or the guilty to be a malicious witness. Lo tiyeh acharei rabim liraot. Don't side with the mighty. It's different translation from multitude, right? Interesting question. Is rabim here mean the many or the strong one or strong ones to do wrong? V'lo taneh aliv lintot acharei rabim lahatot. Here they translate it as, you shall not give perverse testimony in a dispute so as to pervert it in favor of the mighty. Okay, a slightly different translation than we have here. You shall not give perverse testimony in a dispute, incline after the many. And we'll come back to that differentiation. But for starters, we're going to take the translation here and see that in our parasha, we have this phrase, acharei rabim lahatot, which it's hard to translate in the way the JPS does it here, but we could just look at it word for word. Acharei rabim lahatot. One should incline, one should tend, following the masses or the majority. Always a question, and sometimes a question in biblical Hebrew whether Rav means the majority or just the many. But one way or the other, it's possible to interpret this verse as saying, Acharei rabim lahatot, follow the many, follow the majority. This verse, and from that verse flows the fact that the rabbis apply this notion to capital punishment, to damages of other kinds, to ritual law when it is called into question. This verse and the principle of following the majority has a most dramatic expression in the Talmudic story known as Achnai's oven, Tanuro Shel Achnai from Bava Metzia 59b. The heart of that story is a description of a bitter dispute between all of the scholars in the Beit Midrash on the one hand, and Rabbi Eliezer alone on the other. Okay, so we have clearly a majority here and a lone voice. At the climax of their disagreement, a heavenly voice is heard. Okay, and we have now a quote from the Gemara. A heavenly echo emerged and said, "What do you have against Rabbi Eliezer? The law is according to him in every case." The heavenly echo decides that the law is rightly in accordance with Rabbi Eliezer's opinion. This should be the end of the discussion, the end of the story. However, the reaction of the protagonists is not to accept the heavenly decree, rather to oppose it, right? So in this debate this is a story that you may be familiar with, in the debate between the scholars in the Beit Midrash on the one side and Rabbi Eliezer alone on the other side about what the status of this oven was, the heavenly echo says Rabbi Eliezer is correct, but the other rabbis don't accept that, and they oppose it. Rabbi Yoshua stood up on his feet and said, "It is not in heaven," and thereby asserts his opposition to the heaven's decision. The heaven, which seems to be going against the majority, is overruled seemingly in favor of the majority. The Talmudic narrator isn't satisfied with Rabbi Yoshua's reaction and seeks an explanation of his words. What does it mean to say that it is not in heaven? Rabbi Yirmiyah's words are brought in response. Rabbi Yirmiyah said, "For the Torah was already given on Mount Sinai, and we don't need heavenly echoes. As it is already written in the Torah, incline after the many." Okay, so what does it mean it's not in heaven? It means, we don't follow God's word anymore. We follow the Torah. And the Torah gives us a principle of how we rule, which is incline after the many. So even if a heavenly voice comes down and says, "I support the minority," we disregard that because we have the superseding guideline of the Torah itself, which is follow the majority. Rabbi Yirmiyah's response contains a number of stages. First, he distinguishes between two distinct periods of time, before and after the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. We can see our Parashah and its laws serving as a watershed moment between these two separate time periods. Okay, and this is, by the way, just an interesting point on its own, which we encounter all the time in the Midrashim about this, our patriarchs and matriarchs keeping the Torah, in discussions about whether mitzvot that were practiced before the time of the giving of the Torah, like Brit Milah, should they be counted in the 613 mitzvot if they came from before Sinai? The Rambam uses this language in different places where he says, before Sinai, This was one way of doing it. After the Torah was given, there was a different way of doing it. So this is just pointing out something straightforward, but that Parshat Mishpatim really marks, after the revelation at Sinai itself, kind of the beginning of the post-Sinai world, in which we have a whole new set of laws that dictates our practice, and a different theological relationship in some way. What distinguishes between these two time periods? The next stage explains. We don't need the next stage, meaning of the Gemara, explains we don't need heavenly echoes, emphasizing the word we. Rabbi Yirmiyah is explaining that we, the ones who inhabit the Beit Midrash, we who control the judicial process, we who live after the giving of the Torah, we don't listen to heavenly echoes. Maybe others living in a different time period under different conditions would, but definitely not we who are here in this Beit Midrash at this historical moment. Definitely not us. This brings us to the next stage, which essentially answers the question of what to do and how to decide if we aren't heeding heavenly echoes. How can we finalize decisions, right? So there was a time, and it's interesting, by the way, this reminds us of the post-Sinai moments where this comes up again. The few stories after Sinai during the wilderness years where Bnei Israel don't know what to do in a particular moment. The man found gathering wood, the blasphemer, the daughters of Tzalafchad. I think those are the three. And they turn to Moshe, and Moshe says, "Okay, we got to wait. We got to ask God." There are times after Sinai where something is not clear, and in that early stage, they still turn to God. But here, the sages of the Beit Midrash are sort of saying, like, we've gone past that time. We don't wait for or lean on a heavenly voice. We have all the information we need to build out the rulings that we need. Pesach Sheni, yes, thank you, Nathan. Thank you. Yeah, you got it. Of course, caught what I missed. Thank you. This brings us to the next stage, which essentially answers the question of what to do and how to decide. Yes, how can we finalize decisions? This third component of Rabbi Yirmiyah's statement is an expansion on a quotation from the verse from our Parashah that we quoted above. As it is already written in the Torah, incline after the many, right? So the answer to what we do now that we don't depend on the divine voice is we follow the Torah's instruction of majority rule. Meaning now decisions are made through majority rule, we follow the majority. Decisions aren't finalized by fiat of a divine voice, rather by numbers, by counting the individual human voices and seeing where their greater numbers are. The transition from following a heavenly echo or divine declaration to following the majority of the opinions represented in the court is a significant shift of the location of decision-making from heaven to earth. But this is not the only significant shift that Rabbi Yirmiyah's statement describes. It is also a shift from momentary or incidental ruling, each question has a unique divine answer, to a jurisprudential process. Another fundamental difference between the before and after is who is making the decision, as this is seemingly a shift from the divine to humanity. Okay, so again, no great chidush here, but just like really spelling out what's happening in this, in this transitional time, and how significant it actually is for human or Israelite history. However, when Rabbi Yirmiyah substantiates the shift from human beings, or to human beings, I guess, by quoting a verse, he essentially anchors his position that one need not listen to heavenly voices by quoting a heavenly voice. Or you might have noticed this, kind of irony in the text. According to Rabbi Yirmiyah, the principle of following the human majority rule is divine. It is Sinaitic. The independence from God in the future was granted by God at Sinai, right? It's the Torah that tells us Acharei Rabim Lahatot, and that Torah was given by God at Sinai. So the shift to humanity is still divinely mandated or introduced. Right? Thus, in place of the heavenly voice or echo comes the human process, the process of those who are but an image of God. Yes, it is not in heaven, but only in the narrowest sense. And of course, this I think gives, uh, you know, opens up the conversation, the kind of ideological, interpretive conversation about, you know, how we describe this unfolding process of interpretation or of ruling, when we're following the Torah's instruction, the divine instruction to follow the majority, and leads to sort of the discussion of ongoing revelation, continuous revelation. Some people will say, in a way, every ruling is kind of a new expression of God's voice through our mouths. Others may say, the divine voice has stopped, but by carrying out the Torah's instructions, we are sort of continuing to unfold the revelation. Um, what is so surprising and challenging in this is what arises from going back into the biblical text and reading this verse in its context. Okay, so now we're going to shift to the second half. The first half is just to see the way majority rule develops in Jewish texts, that it's a very, very central principle, that it's kind of marks a transition from a different way of answering questions, which is, turning to God, depending on God, and case by case, to a system which is more organized, more human, and has, principles to follow, which should enable some level of kind of um, less spontaneity and more replicability, even though in so doing, it's still following an instruction which comes from God, which comes from the Torah. Now we're going to shift to sort of a second half, which is an interpretive question of, wait a minute, how did we actually get to the notion of majority rule from this verse? What's so surprising and challenging in this is what arises from going back into the biblical text and reading this verse in its context. For in fact, when you read it in its context, it seems to be saying the exact opposite of how Rabbi Yirmiyah reads it. While Rabbi Yirmiyah uses this verse to support the notion of majority rule, actually this verse is brought to condemn the following of a majority. You shall neither side with the many or majority to do wrong. You shall not give perverse testimony in a dispute so as to pervert it in favor of the many or the majority, right? So you see here, by the way, she preserves both the kind of ambiguity in the term rabim, whether it's many or majority. And now she has a translation here which much more clearly mirrors the JPS translation, whereas in the first time around, she gave us the translation that made room to interpret the verse with that last phrase standing alone, acharei rabim lahatot, follow the majority. The words of negation from the verse are not present when Rabbi Yirmiyah is described quoting this verse in the Talmudic discussion. They are left out, thus leaving the reader with a selective quotation of the verse that ends up meaning the opposite of what it means in the biblical narrative, right? So in the pasuk, in the context of the Torah, it's saying, don't be a malicious witness. What does it mean to be a malicious witness? It means to give testimony in order to follow what you think is the dominant or powerful voice. All these people, even though they're not telling the truth, they have the power. So if I'm called upon to testify, I better go along with what they say. And the Torah is saying, don't do that. Don't side with the mighty to do something wrong, l'ra'ot, and don't get, involved in a dispute, leading it in the direction that follows the majority, but is, not the right direction. But when Rabbi Yirmiyah quotes it, he cuts off the lo tan al rivlin tot. Don't get involved to twist a testimony, following the majority, and he just quotes the end part, follow the majority. In order to understand how it can be that our rabbis ground a core jurisprudential principle in a verse that seems ostensibly to reject it, we need to look more closely at the verse. You shall neither side with the many or majority to do wrong. You shall not give perverse testimony in a dispute so as to pervert it in favor of the many or the majority. This verse has a number of clauses. Only the last one, to pervert it or just direct it in favor of the many or majority, is quoted by Rabbi Yirmiyah. This clause in the verse is preceded by a prohibition. It says you should not give perverse testimony to pervert it in favor of the many. This clause regards a situation of riv, dispute, and says don't give perverse testimony in a dispute. It opens with the prohibition, lo ta'neh al riv, you should not give perverse testimony, or you should not give perverse testimony to pervert it in favor of the many or majority. Commentators have interpreted this clause in light of the prohibition in the Ten Commandments of lo taneh v'reacha eid shaker, don't bear false witness against your neighbor, meaning that this is a prohibition on false testimony. According to this, the prohibition of lo taneh within the context of the verse in Mishpatim, is forbidding one to allow the many to seduce him into giving false testimony. Similarly, the opening clause of the verse states that one should not be pressured by the majority or follow the masses toward what is bad and wrong. The verse provides a few scenarios in which that is a likely risk and tells you that you should not join up with the many who are behaving contrary to morality and the law. Reeve seems to be one of these contexts in a dispute or a fight. There's something striking about this reading of the verse, as doing wrong and following the bad is always prohibited, and perjury is wrong whether you are doing it alone or doing it with others or just with their encouragement, right? The whole false testimony is always wrong, and doing something that's not right is always wrong. Why do we kind of bring it into this context of the majority? The verse is adding the context of a group of people who are inciting evil, testifies that there is a need for a specific warning and prohibition when talking about a group that is tending towards the negative. It seems that the verse is not only instructing us that we should not bear false witness for evil or to bear false witness at all, but specifically not to follow the group in these circumstances, right, where we might be under more pressure to do so. Right, we sometimes call this diber hakatuv behoveh. The Torah is talking about the typical case where something will arise, right? So a typical case where you might wind up giving false testimony, not so much motivation to do that, in a vacuum, but when that's where the strong, mighty majority is leaning, it becomes even harder to speak the truth. The verse assumes that there is a need for a specific prohibition of following the majority, a need to strengthen our resistance to doing the wrong thing when following the crowd is involved. The verse subtly intimates that there is a unique level of danger and liability when there is a group working towards a bad ends. There is a chance that we might be lenient and more inclined to just follow what it seems like the many, everyone is doing. The Midrash Halacha explains that it can be difficult to hold a position that is contrary to the one held by those who are around you. Okay, this is the Mechelta de Rabbi Shimon, one of the main halachic midrashim on Sefer Shemot, on our pasuk, Lo taneh al riv lintot, don't give perverse testimony to pervert following the majority. Shelo tomar bishat minyan, dai she'eyeh kerebi ploni, ela emor ma shelefanecha. Right, so what is this verse telling us? So that you don't say at the time of counting, right? This is in the context of where votes are being taken, where every voice counts. At the time of counting the legal positions, it's enough for me to be like this rabbi. Rather, say what accords with what is in front of you. Right? How much more difficult it is to maintain your opinion, maintain your integrity, when it is in opposition to not just one opinion, but many, and in particular when one is a lone voice against evil. And I assume the assumption here is that I'll follow someone else. Either is, that voice is representative of the majority, or maybe even, the Mechilta is sort of saying here, even if it's not a big majority, just don't kind of give up your own voice and say, I'll follow so and so in the way they're going. They're already a majority of one compared to you in some way. But rather say what's in front of you. A close reading of the verses forces us to recognize how difficult it is, in fact, to not join up with the majority to do what is wrong. The positive Talmudic reading of incline after the majority and do not follow the majority to do evil create a composite statement. Through it, the emphasis at the center of the story on this principle shifts from being a simple positive statement of following the majority to one that carries with it echoes of the warning that sometimes one cannot and may not do or say what the majority determines. Even though it can be especially hard to stand up for your own opinion, stand up in the breach for what is right. Let us merit to identify the good and to be brave enough to follow it, to be for it, even if that is not the direction the majority is heading in. Shabbat Shalom. What's interesting to me, amongst other things, is that she doesn't fully answer the question that I think she asks, which is, how does this verse become a proof text for don't follow the majority? Either, it's just it feels like, as she said at the beginning, lots of the halachot that emerge from Parashat Mishpatim, or that tie back to Parashat Mishpatim, don't tie in a straightforward way back. And it feels like here there was already some default presumption of majority rule, and we went back to this pasuk to extract that little phrase. And it's ironic that it actually emerges from a phrase that, talks about um, not following the majority to do evil. But I think that she doesn't say this explicitly, but it feels to me like what's implied there is don't follow the majority to do evil because we follow the majority. And because we follow the majority, you have to be very, very careful about how you use your voice and don't just go along with the majority, i.e., the group who the ruling will follow, because the ruling will follow them. And emor masha lefanecha, say what's in front of you. So again, she doesn't make that explicit, and I think it's important to sort of still reflect on that question. How, in the end of the day, do the rabbis substantiate the notion of majority rule out of the Torah? It's not made quite explicit, but it does sort of feel like it's there as the default assumption inside this verse. Don't follow the majority to do evil because the majority is the one that rules. Um, and I think she wants to sort of read it even more, that when you think about majority rule, you go back to that verse and it actually highlights that what's important is not the basic principle of majority rule, but the many situations in which the temptation is to follow the majority rule to do the wrong thing, and the need to not kind of default to um, going with the flow of majority rule. Majority rule is still the determining principle, but you have to raise your voice and articulate your position even when it's hard, even when it feels like going against the majority, and say it how you see it. Um, so that is a deep dive into a phrase in one pasuk and a kind of ethic that comes out of it from the context and the midrashic material on it. I'll start with Lance. Yep.
Okay. What is the example of majority rules in the oven of Aknai?
It has to do with the ruling of whether the oven itself was tameh or
Nope.
tahor.
Nope.
No,
May I quote?
please.
The sages said on that day, the sages brought all the ritually pure items deemed pure by the ruling of Rabbi Eliezer with regard to the oven and burned them in the fire. And the sages reached a consensus in his regard and ostracized him. Now, if you go to online, you will find that the word consensus can mean a majority opinion.
Hmm.
Okay, now it gets worse. Um, what is the reason why Rabbi Gamaliel is brought into the oven of Aknai?
I don't remember.
Okay, and even Rabban Gamaliel, the Nasi of the Sanhedrin at Yavna, the head of the sages who were responsible for the decision to ostracize Rabbi Eliezer, was coming on a boat at the time, and a large wave swelled over him and influenced and threatened to drown him. Rabbi Gamaliel said, and I quote, "It seems to me that this is only for the sake of Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, as God punishes those who mistreat others." Now it gets even worse. This is Ima Shalom, is Rabbi Gamaliel's sister, and she's playing games with her husband, Rabbi Eliezer. And here's what happens. When she returned, she found him, and that Rabbi Eliezer, and saw that he had lowered his head in prayer. She said to him, "Arise, you already killed my brother." Meanwhile, the sound of a shofar emerged from the house of Rabbi Gamaliel to announce that the Nazi had died. Who killed Rabbi Gamaliel?
I'm not going to answer that question. I mean, the text wants us to imagine in some way that it's Rabbi Eliezer, but I don't think it's a
No,
straight.
no, 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 no,
Uh,
no, no. It's not Rabbi Eliezer.
no,
It's God. The whole point here is, Rav Stephen, that Rabbi Hochstein and, I might add, Rabbi Abraham Heschel stop reading where it's convenient for them to stop. The whole point of the oven of Aknai is to give the rabbis power over the religion and to say that, well, God, even God, if he comes down, speaks in the bat kol voice, he does miracles. It's wrong. What the rabbis say, the rabbis are right and God is wrong. Okay? Now, quoting from the Bible, quoting from the Torah, I would argue that the Kohanim are the ones who are supposed to be in charge of the ritual. That's in the Torah. I didn't make that up. But you see, the rabbis are desperately trying to justify their existence. And the most interesting thing here is that this is not the only parable in which rabbinic Judaism is criticized within the Talmud itself. But it's the main point here, Rav Stephen, is very simple. Rabbi Hochstein did not read the Oven of Aknai. She read what she considers to be a version of it. She did not read down to the last word of the Oven of Aknai, as I have, and as I think many scholars would. And I think this is what the problem that I have is with most of rabbinic Judaism. There's a sense in which the rabbis are justifying the rabbis, and there is no attempt to open up to other possibilities. For example, the Karaites, the Samaritans, the Jewish Igbo, and the Ethiopian Enoch, and
Thank you.
could argue
Thank you.
Messianic Christianity.
I hear the call for inclusion of more voices, and I hear the question about is one being a selective reader of Tanur Shalachnai. I'm not sure. I know that Rabbi Avital Hachstein knows the whole story, and I don't think that it's the case that she's being selected. I think she's quoting from the part that feels relevant to this narrower point. You're introducing a broader point of kind of rabbinic philosophy and rabbinic practice and rabbinic worldview, which absolutely has its place and a call for more pluralism. And I to absolutely, take it and hear it. And I think what I especially appreciate the comment that you sort of raised about like a different um a different force at play in the story about were people standing up in any way to kind of defend Rabbi Eliezer, forget about the ruling about kind of his place in the rabbinic community. So I think there's a lot to unpack there, and I totally appreciate the comments. Thank you, thank you.
Well, I think it's even worse in the sense that I think Rabbi Hochstein is espousing a Shalom Hartman left-wing Israeli position.
I'm going to leave that where it is. Thank you. Other thoughts on the approach of kind of following the majority more broadly, its place in Jewish text, and its kind of relation to how it's being read um, in this essay or in the Parsha. Sometimes it just is what it is. Give a moment for anyone else. Yes, Bracha, please, before we wrap up, please.
Yeah, I have nothing conclusive. I just appreciate Rabbi Hochstein's attempt to caution people about following the majority when it's towards something evil.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And the remarkable thing is not remarkable, not surprising, but she's lifting up something which is just simply the Torah's straightforward comment, but often it is sort of subsumed. The more you read rabbinic literature and you get comfortable quoting that phrase, "Acharei rabim lahatot," then when you hear the Torah read, you just sort of like gloss over the first verse and a half and say, "Oh yeah, this is the place where we talk about majority rule," but that's really not the emphasis of the pasuk at all. And the rabbis in the process of building their judicial processes, needed to lean into procedural rules and guidelines. And she's sort of, I think, as you said very nicely, kind of restoring the emphasis on where the Torah puts the emphasis. Yes, we need judicial rules and principles, but the most compelling message the Torah is telling us is to not just say, I love that Mechilta that she quoted, not just say, Dai she'ehiyeh Rebbe Ploni, it's good enough for me to follow so and so. Because it's an interesting, I guess the in the context of the Mechilta, I assume it's talking about kind of one judge looking at another judge, but of course I can't help hearing it, as also sort of posing a question about the democratization of, Jewish legal rulings altogether. Right? Is it also saying to a non-rabbinic person, to say, don't just follow what your rabbis say. You have to say say it as it appears in front of you. Right? That we all have access. This may be an anachronistic reading, but it jumps off the page to me to sort of say, like, we all have access to the texts that are in front of us. Certainly, even if you're asking a question and you get an answer from a rabbi and something that's in front of you seems to go against it, don't say, I'll just be like or follow Rabbi Ploni, but emol mashalafanecha. Say it how you see it in front of you, and offer that follow up. So I think there's it's not just in the kind of moral universe of following the majority for evil, and speaking your truth, but also just when you get information or rulings, assert your questions and positions based on what you see in front of you until you're satisfied.
May I have a couple of points?
Yeah, we're going to go to David L., and then we'll wrap up with Lance.
I'll cede the floor to the gentleman from the Hartman Institute.
I wanted to make one comment.
Yes, Debbie.
It just seems so ironic that this pasuk would teach the opposite of what it seems when you read it.
Yeah.
That's all.
Yeah. Yep. I think she's demonstrated that to us very well, and always reminds us to slow down as we read. Yep. Lance, go ahead.
Okay, 2 points. One, how does Rabbi Hochstein understand Korach?
You haven't gotten there yet, but she definitely has an essay on it.
Main point, which I'm going to suggest now, is a way of supporting rabbinic Judaism is very simple. It's the concept of the Mara d'Atra, the decisor of the locality, which means, Rabbi Exler, if you are the Mara d'Atra, no one in the world outside of the locality, even within the locality, as long as you are the legitimate Mara d'Atra, can make you do a decision that you don't want to do. Am I right? For example, if the OU came down and said, Rabbi Exler, you should do this, that, or the other thing, you have every right not to follow them, right?
Yeah, seems to be.
That's all.
Great.
The defense rests.
Okay. Great. David L., are we circling back to you for any closing thoughts?
Sure. I was going to give you back the mic and say, Rav Stephen, what compelled you to pick this as a source for this week?
So truly nothing, in the sense that there's only one Rabbi Avital Hochstein essay on each Parsha. So unlike some of the other, Rav Meidan and things like that, where I sort through, this is just you get what you get on any given week. But look, I'll take the I don't know if I should call it bait or pitch or whatever it is, to say, yeah, we're certainly living in moments where there's all kinds of strong voices and potential assumptions, and I don't know, it's actually sometimes hard to know what the majority voice is. But in with so much heady stuff going on in Israel and domestically, sometimes we find ourselves in conversations where we feel everything siding one way, and we might have a different voice. And I guess I can certainly ask myself, how in what way does the ethic apply here? Here we're talking about counting up votes and kind of registering an official stance that counts towards something. So I don't want to be hasty to sort of say, like, the lesson here is, if you're sitting in a conversation and it seems to be heading in one direction and you don't agree, that you must speak up. I'm not sure that I think that's always the case. I would differentiate if someone said, like, well, what's your opinion? Like if you're sitting in a conversation that's, where there seems to be a conventional or accepted stance, someone turns to you and says, well, what's your opinion? That at least the Mechilta would say, you know, you shouldn't, again, it's the context there is bishat minyan. But yeah, when counting up stances, I think there is some ethic that you want to avoid just saying, I'm good with what you guys are saying. If you don't feel that way, you could, emol masha lefanecha means you could say, I'm not sure. I'm at the very least, I'm not sure I see it the same way when I look at what's in front of me. So it certainly feels like it's again, I wouldn't say as I think about conversations that one always needs to pipe up to dissent, but kind of when called out or called in or called upon, there's an integrity to not just going with the flow if that's not where you feel you are. So that's one possible application to our current moment. Thanks everybody for bearing with the late start, and wonderful to learn together. Great to have some new folks joining, and look forward to continuing next week. Love to mom and dad.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Shavua Tov.
So.
Thanks.